I'm Steve Moss, and I'm founder and president of Executive Springboard. We mentor executives in various stages of transition. And with me today is my friend Gregg Tate. In addition to having his own coaching and mentoring consultancy, Gregg is an Executive Springboard mentor. And Gregg spent over 30 years as a global HR executive with Adidas. We'll talk for the next hour about global executive mobility. I know some of you in the audience have had international assignments. We're delighted to have you join us and to participate in the discussion. Gregg, I'd welcome you to talk a little bit about your own experience in Asia, in Europe, and in the United States with Adidas.
Yeah, it was an interesting scenario. Out of my 30 years with Adidas, 21 of them were in a nation that was not my home country. Twice I was based in Germany, and once I was based in Hong Kong in between, with the Hong Kong role being Asia Pacific regional role that covered everything from Japan to New Zealand, north to south, and India to Indonesia, east to west, and all points in between. And we used to laugh and talk about planning careers, and the joke was that at Adidas, careers aren't planned; they just happen. And if I look at my own scenario, I ended up in Germany by making a comment on a phone call with somebody one day, and there was dead silence for a minute, and it was like, "You would come to Germany?" Because I was flying back and forth like every other week. So, little did we know that that would turn into 21 years of all over the world, and meeting great people and working with great people, and just being fortunate enough to gain the experiences that you do that you don't get when you sit at home all the time, kind of
Yeah,
thing. So,
yeah.
but it was started out in a new area that we were building in Germany at the time, an HR global services team, where we were really beginning to look at what does it mean to have internationally mobile talent, and how do you take care of them, and how do you move them, and it kind of grew from there, and moved on, and for the last 6, almost 7 years now, officially retired from that part of the world, and kind of doing my own thing, and taking the experiences I got and the mistakes I made, and trying to help others not make them as they go forward. So
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about that. I'm kind of interested. What was Adidas? It sounds like you were building this out. So correct me if I'm wrong, but were there things that Adidas did to prepare you for that first move, and or what lessons did you learn that you were able to put in practice as an HR leader to make the process better?
yeah, at the time I moved, Adidas on a global basis had what we today would call uh, internationally mobile personnel, but they had all been predominantly from headquarters out of Germany.
Germany. Yeah.
And they were being done, they were on the product development and sourcing side of the business. So they were being basically transferred to Hong Kong, and then from Hong Kong being seconded out to China, Vietnam, Malaysia, where all the manufacturing and things were going on. And so it began to, we had a situation where the US subsidiary was being taken over by a management group, a bunch of former Nike guys that if you go watch the movie, you'll see some names. If I call them, you'll recognize them. But anyway, with these guys getting in, they'd been doing contract work for Adidas in Germany. And when they came back to start to run the US, they had certain people that they'd been working with they wanted to bring. So it first started out of me being the head of HR in the US, working with the head of HR in Germany, trying to figure out how do we bring these 3 or 4 or 5 German guys to the US when you already have that same talent already available to you in the
In
US.
the US.
Why do you need those guys? And how do you get them visas? And well, why did they get visas and nobody else? And it was quite a creative scenario that we had management contracts and all kind of things going on to make it work and fit. And this was what was spurring all of a sudden me going back and forth to Germany like every other week, trying to sort these things down. And that phone call I just mentioned, So ultimately, when I ended up bouncing over to Germany, I literally was fully transferred and became effectively a local hire in the headquarters in Germany. We used to call us said I was a local foreigner. I was fully on the German contract. I was fully on the German payroll. I was fully on the German benefit system, fully on the German retirement system. I had no links, no nothing tied back to the U.S. Um, and then when that 2-year contract turned into 6 years, and then when I got another offer to go to Asia for 2 years, and that turned into 6 years, began to think, you know what? Does anybody in the U.S. even remember me? Because there've been so many changes.
Right.
Did I still have tenure and service years ongoing in the calendar back here? So yeah, I mean, you begin to think, in that first move, we built that global services team, and that's what we were starting to look at. What do you need to do? How do you build this up? For international assignment personnel, if you're IAPs, global nomads, whatever you call them. So yeah, it was almost like moving into nothing. And we didn't have to start from scratch because they did have that program they had been doing from Germany to Hong Kong, but we had to try to figure that out. How do you make that applicable on a global basis? And everybody can't be headquarter based, which is the way they had been doing it before. So it was kind of taking a machete to the woods as we went through and cut our own path and figured out. And a lot of things we did then are probably, well, I know they were still happening for quite a number of years before I retired and stepped out, but we had certainly matured it a lot and brought a lot more to the table and had people focused and specializing in that area. But yeah, it was frontier days.
Yeah.
The frontier was across many oceans.
And as you're doing this, and it seemed like the impetus for this was that phone call that you had. I'm wondering now, as you started putting structure in place, what were some of the things that Adidas started looking for in terms of the candidates for an international assignment?
Yeah, I mean, the first lesson goes back to that phone call, and you learn, be careful what you say and who you say it to, because you never know what's going to happen with it. But I mean, things that we would look at today and say, well, these are just old hat. I mean, yeah, everybody does this. So we're 38 years ago, none of that was happening. Almost 39 years ago, we were kind of, as I said, kind of making it up as we went along. I can remember having a meeting with 3 consultants from the company Mercer when they were still in existence before they got taken over and everything. And I was explaining our organization to them and what we were trying to accomplish. And the guy looked at me and says, "You guys are more complicated than General Motors." And it's like, yeah, you're trying to move all these different places, and you had a corporate structure that was not a global structure. You had a structure where basically every subsidiary kind of did their own, but they had all policies and those. So, I mean, we were leaders and.
Sorry, we are losing you, Greg, a little bit.
Greg,
I'm not sure about it.
Breaking up a little bit.
Is that better?
That's better.
Much better.
Okay. Maybe the internet decided to fluctuate a little bit. No, so we were starting with.
Uh-oh.
Did you freeze again?
To be, what's the minimum that they can expect to have as they go, and then now today it's much more set up. I mean, you look at it and you realize that you have to have the before picture, the during picture, and the after picture. At the time I was involved in first getting into that, there was probably the before picture, might have been some during, and nobody was really thinking about the after.
The after picture.
Just because that had never been the habit. It's people get sent out and they're there until they're starting to scream like, "Hey, remember me? Bring me home."
What was even the decision making that took place on whether it was a secondment versus a transfer? Because you came in and they weren't thinking anything except transfer at the time, right?
Exactly. The closest they came to what would today be known as a secondment would be with these product development and these sourcing guys that got transferred to Hong Kong, and then they went out to work in China, wherever, but they were still on the Hong Kong payroll. They still had the benefit program based out of Hong Kong, everything. So it wasn't quite even that. So, secondment was something that was a new thing with Adidas that evolved over the time that we were there. And then it was getting to the point that, you would send somebody out on a 2-year assignment or whatever. And then, you had to say, all right, but that's great. But now what are you going to do with them when they come back? That's the during and then the after scenario. And they started looking at that rather than literally, I went to Germany effectively with a one-way ticket, so to speak. I mean, if I'd gone there and spent my 2 years, there was no guaranteed coming back to my role back in the States or any role back in the States. I mean, you'd kind of have to say, well, hopefully somebody would remember and use some clout to make that happen. But, it turned out didn't need it. But yeah, it was just non-existent and stuff we, had to grow toward as we went on, because I had one board member who he liked to say, but what is everybody else doing? So, you go try to make a pitch for, we need to do ABC 1, 2, 3, whatever that is. His favorite thing was, yeah, but what's everybody else doing? Or, do we have data that tells us we need to do this, that, or the other thing? So, you had to come at him with survey data. And no matter what you'd want to do, he'd want to know. And you finally would want to go to him and say, you know what, this data is useless. There's only about 9 companies in the industry that we're in.
Right.
And so it's not like you got this massive database of where it's going to go. And of the 9, we've all, had a very incestuous relationship where we've swapped talent back and forth. So, we had Nike people and Converse people and Reebok people, and they had our people. And, everybody knew everybody's too small of an industry. Mm-hmm. And, you go to Asia, everybody was getting the product made in the same factories. They're all right there together in the same place. And they all stayed in the same hotels or apartment complexes. They all went to lunch and dinner together, whatever. It's just whatever color suit they happen to be wearing, uniform. So his complete screaming for data, was useless. But it at least planted the seed for how do we look going forward. And finally, we looked at one day and said, you know what? It's not just us. Yes, if I'm looking for, footwear development people, yeah, that's a pretty small group. But if I'm looking for finance people, technology people, HR people, marketing people, they can come from any industry. Now we have to utilize the bigger play and the bigger data. And that became a big springboard into really maturing and polishing up and putting some horsepower behind the program that we had. And I think was probably the greater impetus behind us really getting something moving.
So another thing is you mentioned that you were like on a German contract, and I imagine then the move to Asia was on a Hong Kong contract.
Yep.
And at some point you've got to sit there and say, geez, what's happening to me in my benefits as relates to eventually coming back home. So I guess like on a personal level, you had to do some advocating for yourself.
Sure.
But how did that work into kind of what might become a much more complex view of how people get assigned and who they're attached to?
Sure. I go back and say I made a lot of mistakes along the way, and some of what we're talking about right here were maybe some of the mistakes I made.
Yeah.
And that didn't know any better. It was pure innocent mistakes. But so I moved to Germany with a 2-year contract. Okay, I'm out of the U.S. system for 2 years. I'm 40 years old. I'll be back in a couple of years. Back in it, no big deal. But that 2 years became 6. And then I got
12. Right.
Yeah. I got shipped off to Asia for a 2-year contract, and that became 6. And a lot of stuff had changed. A lot of personnel had changed. A lot of the structure of the company had changed. Different CEO at the time. So a lot of different things in play. And it come to the point that when nearing the end of my tenure in Hong Kong, we were changing the global business model from a regional model to a direct to customer model. meaning we were going to do away with these regional offices, which I had been part of. And I was already in the conversation to come back to Germany in the role I ultimately came back to. But we had a guy who was the head of HR for our golf company in California who, while I was home on vacation, got an email that he was retiring. Now, the backstory on this is this guy used to retire like every other week. So, we didn't pay it a whole lot of attention until this official announcement came out. So I actually called my boss. That's the way, is this one real now? And it was like, yes. And you're the number one person on the succession list there. You should go through California, talk to the CEO out there. So that's why I'm on my way back to Hong Kong next week. I'll, reroute. Went out, met the CEO, loved the job, loved the place. Would have been great if I was planning on retiring myself in a couple of years. But it's just, the thing was just to say, I've still got more years. I want to continue to play on the bigger global stage. So I opted to stay with the role that I had, which brought me back to Germany. This time on a 3-year contract. So do the math and guess how long I stayed. But I was able to say at the point in time, hey, look, I have been out of the U.S. benefit system, U.S. retirement system, U.S. everything system for now 12 years. We've got to do something before I stay in this. We had acquired the Reebok company at the point in time, who had their headquarters in Massachusetts. And we were able to put me on a Reebok contract in Massachusetts and second me to Germany, which then let me be part of U.S. benefit structure and all of those type of things, which got me back in. Now, sitting here as retiree and Social Security recipient and all those other things, I'm looking back on the loss of 12 years earnings in the Social Security system. See that, once you start to look at those funds coming each month, that they could be a lot larger had they been otherwise. But again, mistakes that you make and that you try to help others avoid when you go forward.
So you, in a situation like that, you're in a position where you can at least make recommendations on what the policies are going to be.
Sure.
What would you suggest? I'm kind of curious of maybe even like a top 5 list of do's and don'ts for people in their first international assignment. But specifically, I wonder what you would suggest to somebody in terms of how they can advocate for themselves when they're going on an assignment. Because it's, we hear some of the horror stories of people kind of who get placed somewhere and then get forgotten about.
Yeah. Yeah, we used to have a whole army of them. I mean, these guys were just there. They were names on the list, and they were somewhere off in Asia or whatever, and had been there for 10 years or whatever.
And maybe they didn't mind, and maybe that's why they were staying there. But in terms of managing your career, it's kind of important to be able to advocate for yourself in this.
Oh, absolutely. And fortunately, I think most companies, at least most U.S. based companies that are looking at international assignment personnel today, probably have a lot of these things already in play. But I would, first say, as you say, how do you advocate for yourself? One, do your homework. That was something I didn't do. Like I said, I made this conversation, and in fact, the guy that I was talking to at the time was the head of HR. We didn't call it CHRO or whatever. He was just a senior vice president of HR at headquarters. And I had a mail from him. We had sent him something over Christmas. And I said he had sent me something back today. He's 86. And he was sending back and he was saying, I still have that global mobility policy that was written way back when. And was talking about when I first came over there and was, putting first pen to paper on that. So, that would be the thing I would say, advocate for yourself by first doing your homework so you can have an intelligent conversation. Understand then what it's going to be, what's going to be like. You got, I guess, a couple of ways to look at it. What is it for me? What does it mean for my family? What's going to be expected, while I'm there? And then what can I look forward to on a return? And a lot of times people may not can answer that, but you want to start that thought process. And I think a lot of people are hesitant to talk about what's the return going to look like, because we're talking about something down the road before I've even done what I'm being asked to do now. and a lot of people hold back from that, but you got to do that. It's the longer term planning. It goes what I said in the beginning. You got to look at a before, a during, and an after where these things go. And if you're in somebody's positioning this for you as an IAP, and they're not showing you these things, you need to start asking about them and questioning, is it really in place? Most people, when you ask it, if it's a program that's in place and they've got it, it's available, they're going to lay it right out for you. Ideally, they're going to lay it out for you before you even have to ask. But understanding those different elements in play will certainly pay off in the longer run as far as fewer headaches, fewer problems, less sleepless nights, whatever you would want to say.
Yeah. I want to ask you a little bit about the responsibility you see from the host company. I've been in situations where I brought somebody to the United States and they were not very well accepted. And this was somebody who was functionally maybe the best we had in the organization, in his position, and because he was coming from a different market, that really wasn't accepted, and it was a really difficult thing for him, a really difficult thing for me as his boss, because he had a big job to do, and I found myself trying to play that role of champion for him in a lot of situations. So I'm wondering if you saw that in Hong Kong or in Germany as people came over, and what are some of the things that you could suggest from an organization standpoint, whether it's part of the culture or whether it's, even just behaviors of leadership team going out and making sure that that person and their family feel welcome. What are some of the things that you saw and what come to mind for how that the organization can become more inclusive?
Yeah. If I look at my first trip to Germany and my move to Hong Kong, those were almost like night and day from the standpoint of when I first went to Germany, I was something of an anomaly. There were a few non-Germans there, but they were predominantly European. To my knowledge, there were only 2 other Americans in the headquarters at the time, and we're like 3,500 employees. And I was the only non-German in the headquarters HR team. So that was, so that was they had to remember, if I'm in the meeting, they got to speak English, not German. What you find is after you're there for a while, you sort of blend into the woodwork. And the next thing you're in a meeting and you're saying, "I'm glad I took a German course because I understand every third word," or something. On the other side, when I went to Hong Kong, they had international people for years and years and years. So it was not anything new for them. That they had people from, again, most of them Europeans, a couple of Americans had been there off and on, but that was a different scenario. The first key, I think, of moving somebody is understanding the cultural fit, and it's you got to look at, it's more than what my skill is or what my experience is. Am I going to fit in the particular culture I'm being sent to? And we used to talk with a lot of particularly folks from the U.S. coming over. This is after I'm already there now. We're already building these programs, and kind of saying, look, guys, you have to, if you come anywhere, I don't care if it's when you're coming to Germany, you're coming to Hong Kong, you're going to wherever. If you're coming there expecting it or everything to be like home, you're going to be very, very unhappy. Now, that being said, just because it's not like home or not like they do it at home doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it's different. So you got to have somebody who's got that adaptability as far as personality, and is able to be comfortable being uncomfortable, I guess, is a bit of it, as we would say now. But not having all the answers, not even knowing most of the questions, to get into. So that's one of the first ones you start to wrestle with, because that can make or break an assignment. And the second one is if you are moving not only the employee but his or her spouse into a family, that you got to make sure is also being taken care of and being handled, because a trailing spouse can be the death knell of any assignment, if they're not taken care of, and make sure that they're looked out for and have certain opportunities. I mean, we had a situation when by the time I moved to Hong Kong, all the handover and everything had already happened. My wife's passport was actually stamped not allowed to work. Because the Hong Kong, China was taking over at that point in time and trying to drop on the number of international folks there in order to provide employment for the Chinese. So it wasn't to say she couldn't if she had wanted to. She would have to go through some hoops, but straight out of the bow, she couldn't just show up and go down the street and get a job tomorrow. It just wasn't going to happen. So yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the first preliminary homework or whatever needs to be done, and looked at who you're going to move, not just I mean, it's easy from a corporate standpoint. So, I mean, this guy is a sales genius. He's going to come in here and he's going to hit the road, and we're going to jack our numbers up and blah blah blah. Look, does he speak the language? Does he understand the culture? Is he going to fit in? Who's he going to rub the wrong way, inside, outside the company? Yeah, all of these things that have to go into play, that have to be taken into consideration if you hope to have any shred of having a successful assignment.
It's funny. I had one international assignment, and it was across the U.S. Canadian border. So my first time as a chief marketing officer had me moving from the United States to Canada, and you'd think, well, how different is that? It's different.
Yep.
It's different. The language is more different than you think. When somebody says they're going to table an idea, that doesn't mean they're taking it off the table. It means they're putting it on the table, right? 3 o'clock in the morning, our baby is crying for some milk. I'm cutting open a bag of milk. There were things just that would happen. I mean, if you stepped on a Canadian's toe in an elevator, they would apologize. So there were a bunch of things that were quite different from the United States, and even though the language looked awfully familiar, there were some aspects of the culture that were quite different, and a culture that was quite proud of what they had. Yep. And so that was, that it was the language part made it easy perhaps to start fitting in. If you thought that everything would be the same because of the language, you'd never make it.
No, in fact, you and I spoke about this the other day. I'd gone to a seminar, I guess you would say. It was a SHRM conference, and a lady was speaking on international mobility, and she was with Deloitte, and she herself had done 9 different foreign assignments. Oh. And she said the hardest one that she did was to the UK, because she said even though she had already done like 4 at the time, the fact that they spoke English and she was not going to have to go somewhere there was a foreign language, and that she'd be understand what people said and she'd be able to read. She said, I just let my guard down on other stuff. I took stuff to the UK that I didn't need to take because it wouldn't work anyway. I mean, it was the wrong electrical current. And right. She said, literally, I even moved a washer and dryer. And the washer, here in the U.S., they have hot water and a cold water. Over there, you have one water that the machine heats up. Right. So she says, I got these 2 big appliances that are useless. But she said things like, so language becomes either our greatest common denominator or our biggest barrier, if we're not careful how it goes. So your Canadian story fits that same thing with it.
Yeah. My family loved their time in Canada. The kids were really little. My oldest started first grade there and learned to sing "O Canada" before she could sing the Star Spangled Banner. And we were hoping for another assignment that didn't happen, and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But I'm wondering from your standpoint how the moves went with your family, and whether if I mean, I can imagine if it was at all bumpy going to Germany, there would have been some really tough discussions on the move to Hong Kong afterwards.
Fortunately, the move was only my wife and I.
Okay.
Because the 2 boys were old enough that they were back here. They didn't make the move. And she was then able to work as well when we went to Germany, because we were both working for Adidas at the time, and she was in the tech side of the business. She was a business liaison as we were doing is when we were implementing SAP. So if we go back to everybody in the world trying to go on the SAP systems, so she was part of the U.S. Team that came over, and then while they were there, they knew she was staying because I was staying. When that part was done, they ended up sending her to the UK. She worked on the team over there. They sent her to Sweden. She worked on the team over there. She worked back in the headquarters when the Germany thing did. So she kind of was working and had her thing going as well. So that was the easy part. Then we got ready to make the Hong Kong move, and of course she couldn't work. But in all solid credit to her, she moved to Hong Kong without ever having been to Hong Kong. We didn't even do a look-see trip. She just said, "Hey, it's where you're supposed to go. That's the next step. Here we go." We loaded up and went. And then, the return was going to be California. Oh, okay, we're going to get back to the States. And it's like, you know what? That's just not the right role. We go back to Germany. Good thing we loved Germany when we were there before. And even though she wasn't going to, now when she got back, her former boss was saying, "Hey, do you want to come?" And she said, like, "No, thank you. I'm retired."
Yeah.
But she that part worked for us well. So we didn't have kids to consider.
Yeah.
But of course, people I've worked with and all, we did. And in the role I was in, we were having to work with that. And at the time, there was no international school in that little town in Germany. We were Adidas was part and parcel and key major sponsor on establishing and developing what is now the international school in the Nuremberg area. But kids coming over, they had no school. They either had to learn German and go to school in Germany, or had to get special dispensation to do homeschooling. And not every parent is cut out to homeschool, and so there are a lot of things and considerations to be taken into account.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the check it out piece, because that did happen to me later. I was offered an assignment in Argentina, and we went down over Thanksgiving weekend for a house hunting trip, my wife and I, and went to an American school, looked at a bunch of things, and just came away with the thought it wasn't right for us, certainly not at that time, and particularly for our girls. So yeah, but a lot of people don't have that chance. They'll just go there and figure out once they're there that that's not necessarily the right thing. Okay, I want to talk for a couple of minutes on that during piece, and then certainly cover the after piece. And the other folks on the call, I hope there are some questions that you want to ask along the way, and invite you to chime in at any point. And this may be different if you're there and you don't know whether it's going to be 2 years or 6 years, but I wonder if you see kind of a difference in the risk profile that an expat might have versus the people in the host company. If I'm being seconded, and my situation in Canada was a 3-year assignment, it stayed to a 3-year assignment. It was a question of what I was going back to, and we can cover that off. But it was as much as anything, thinking about something that for me was only going to be there for 3 years. It's less likely that I'm going to have to live with the results than the people who, that's their market. And I'm wondering if that was something that you saw, how to deal with, what have you.
From my own personal standpoint, I don't think I did, or at least looking back on it, even while I was doing it, I don't think I had the short timers disease, so to speak. I mean, a lot of people say, "It's 2 years. I can pretty much tolerate anything for 2 years." I don't think that was the case. I never felt like it was the case. And if we talk to some of my colleagues, they say, "Oh yeah, you were totally checked out," whatever, I would be surprised. But I have seen that, to where everybody, you're all excited about, here's a new adventure, and all of a sudden you get there and maybe it's not what you thought it was going to be. And sometimes there are legitimate reasons. Something happens back home, and all of a sudden things fall apart. But taking things like that aside goes back a little bit to doing the homework, both on the company side and yours as the assignment personnel. Making sure you're looking at what you're getting into. Um, but I mean, the great scenario is looking at it as the stepping stone.
Yeah.
And what? Okay, now I'm having the opportunity to gain something that my colleagues that were around me 6 months ago in the office back home aren't getting this. You see scenarios, and we may touch on this in the after piece of it, but I mean, you see scenarios where you get expatriated to a certain place, depending on how big a place it is and how big your operation is, where you go there. You may have some mega responsibilities and some mega authority, and able to do some things that all of a sudden you do get shipped back home, and holy moly, my boss here can't make the decisions I was making back
Oh,
wherever.
man,
Let's
I
me
lived,
be able to make them.
I lived that. Yep.
Yeah, and that becomes a reality. But it's kind of understanding it. And I think everybody has to look at what is my longer term picture, and trying to keep that in focus. And we used to try from a standpoint of our HR team as well as our international mobility people, trying to instill that in people making the move. Don't look at this as a one step move. Look at not only what's your next step from here, but what is your longer term career goal, and how are you going to be able to parlay this and draw upon this and making the right career decisions down the road, and advancing down the right pathways and things that you'd want to go to.
If I can add a question on top of that, um, what do you see about where loyalties lie? It's and for you, I mean, the first move, you're out of the U.S. system, you're in Germany, that's headquarters. I get it. It's pretty clear that there can be a loyalty to to where you are, the in-market situation. But then you move to Hong Kong. It's not going to be forever, and maybe you feel more. I just wonder whether there's a feeling of, even though I'm under contract in Hong Kong, am I looking more towards Germany or even the United States for where the next step is? And how do you see that playing out in people's success in their roles?
Big answer
Sorry,
to
we can't. Yeah.
quick answer to a big question is yes, that has to be a view of where that goes. Back to the personal situation, when I first made the move to Germany, within the company, as I said before, there had been this scenario where all the different subsidiaries around the world had kind of been their own companies. It just happened to have the same name, and the globalization process was taking place, and there was like mega animosity between the United States and Germany where this was concerned. I mean, if Germany said it's black, the U.S. said it's white. If they said go left, the U.S. says we're going right. So I was at one point even looked at maybe as a traitor, that I had jumped ship, and gone over, and which then put me on the other side in Europe with some of the guys who'd been fighting that U.S. stuff. They were like wondering, was I a spy?
You're a spy, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I've got to try to figure out how to straddle the fence and stay in that way. But then let's say when you move to Hong Kong, so everybody here's from somewhere else. I mean, it's like going to Dubai. I mean, there's like 15% Emiratis, to 85% from somewhere else. That was the way our Hong Kong operation was. Everybody was from somewhere other than Hong Kong. But yeah, I mean, you have to look at that scenario. And the traditional companies, you're going to see the move from headquarters out to different places. We had a scenario where I was going from a subsidiary, into headquarters, which was a bit of an inverted position as well. But I knew in a longer term career scenario, I would have a better deal of launching something out of headquarters somewhere else,
Right.
than I would have if I had come from
Yes.
headquarters to the U.S. Where would I have gone? So, I think that was a play as well.
Yeah, I had a situation in this time in Canada. Canada was more aligned with the UK, which was global headquarters, than the US was. Canada was more aligned with the UK than they were with the US, although they both reported into the the same person, a North American person. But there was, in large part because Canada was more or less a rounding error, they left us alone. We had a change in CEOs and a change in who that CEO was reporting to. And before the change in CEOs, there was a change in the U.S. reporting, the Canadian reporting to the U.S. The person who Canada then reported to had been my mentor in the U.S. Caused an immediate problem with my boss, the CEO in Canada. Yep. Because as you're saying, well, okay, it wasn't like I was placed there as the spy, but it's pretty hard for that to be seen as any other thing. And where's the loyalty? Yep. There, right? So difficult there. Okay, let's talk a little bit about that after part, right? Everything went real smoothly for me in Canada until it came to coming back. And part of it was we kind of got the bug and we're really interested in another assignment, and we were hoping for Europe. Europe went through a reorganization about 6 months before my time in Canada was going to end, and there was no place for me. So a scramble went underway to find something for me in the US. And I ended up working with somebody who had been calling on me in Canada. He was head of a small part of international business, and he was a friend. So there were a lot of things that worked out really well for me in that, but it was a placeholder spot, and it was obvious that it was a placeholder spot, and it was one of the things that I was trying to work through in that role. Number one, as you said earlier, recognizing that it was a smaller role than I had before I left for Canada. And exactly as you said, my boss couldn't make the decisions that I had been making in Canada. And that's a tough thing, and it happens over and over again. It's close to 40% of returning executives exit their companies in the first year back, which makes this so risky an endeavor. And I'm wondering, Gregg, if you or Pranav or Alex have any suggestions on what you can do to fight off that cynicism that can come in for that executive returning, and at the same time, we lost you there for a minute.
We lost Gregg.
Yeah.
Okay, I got Gregg back.
Yeah, apologies. I don't know what happened. Like you were talking, you said placeholder spot, and then.
Okay, well, all right. Well, two things I'm trying to get at here. A little bit about how do you fight the cynicism that an executive returning has, because their job may not be their responsibility, the decision making that they have is more limited than where they may have just come from. And and what can organizations do to try to make the work that they're coming back to meaningful instead of as it was in my case?
I mean, numbers are staggering. The numbers of super qualified individuals that companies lose after international assignments just because they aren't prepared for them to come back appropriately. I mean, it's astronomical. And that's where I've always said it's the before, the during, and the after. And you can't put that after off until it's time for after. This has to be part of the overall planning. And it's understanding. And if you're part of a company that already has a lot of international mobility to begin with, there's much more experience with this.
There's a group.
The things are in place. When you're, with a company that, we ship somebody off like once every 3 years, and they occasionally come back, or you got to make it up, and a lot of those fail just because of that. But I think it's real, and the hiccups are, you go off to wherever and you're coming back home, and you're going to be working with a group of people who have no idea what it's like to experience what you've experienced. Yeah, I mean, you know these people because you see them in Zoom calls or you've talked to them on the phone, but you don't know them. You've not worked side by side with them day in and day out. You don't get the personalities and all these things. You have a ton of experience that these people will never get unless they get on a plane and go somewhere for X number of years.
Mhm.
So in the same way that you look at the cultural fit on going out, there also has to be the cultural evaluation or assessment of, can this person come back in and not come back in with the big swelled head like, hey, I mean, I got all the answers, but you got to come back and fit in. And you got to be realistic in helping the person know, look, you're in this capacity when you left, you've gone out, you've done such and such, you're going to come back and you go in that capacity, and the hierarchy, what goes with that role, where, these are all discussions. Is there a panacea for all of it, or a be all end all? No, I mean, it's still going to, because we're dealing with people and everybody's different. And I think, you have to be willing to acknowledge that and be able to work with the differentiations that come with. I mean, there are 4 of us on here. We're all different. We have different experiences. We have different personalities, different likes and dislikes. And, we're all going to adapt to or not adapt to certain situations. And I think those have to at least be things that are acknowledged and addressed where and if and how possible. But, we always get it right. No, you have to be willing to understand that as well.
Yeah, I think what. Oh, sorry, Steve. Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah,
I mean,
please.
there's the work piece of it, but there's also the reverse culture shock of just going back to this town you lived in 3 years ago, and like, that restaurant closed. My friend group isn't there anymore, so your family's going through all that as well when you're trying to readjust. So I think the biggest thing for us, because we were in England for 2.5 years, was we didn't expect it to be harder to come back to some extent than it was to go. Because when we went, we knew it was going to be different, and you're kind of ready for that. But the world changes while you're gone, and it's just that was one of those things we weren't really expecting when we came back. Greg, I liked what you said earlier though too, because in terms of what's your overall career goal? Like I was working in Ford Motor Company, so like there are people that work with Ford their entire careers, and the idea of whether or not you needed international experience came in and out of vogue depending on who the leadership of the company was. So um, the question of would you take an international assignment or not? One, I think you guys are absolutely right. Depends on what the job is. It is a good fit for what you're going to do, but is it going to help you on your path to the ultimate job you want in the company? And if you can't clearly answer that, it may not be the right move.
Yeah, I would fully agree. Fully agree. And it's, just for the sake of seeing another country for a couple of years, if that's what you want to do, it's what you want to do. But is that going to play into your long-term career?
No.
It's goes to the doing your homework, both the company and the candidate, making sure you're figuring those type of things out. I mean, it's not for everybody. I don't care.
Right.
You may be the greatest, most skilled person we've got in this 100,000 person company, but you know what? You just doing that role in country X is not for you.
Yeah. The other thing is when I went to, they were very clear. I talked to a couple of executives who've been overseas and they said, have an exit strategy. Like do make sure you have a plan to come back.
Yeah.
Before you leave the soil, have a plan to come back. So one of the things I did is every 6 months, I would come back and meet with my executive sponsor or meet with the rest of the communications team, so they all didn't forget me because, in spite of Ford valuing overseas assignments, there was a big out of sight, out of mind problem because they would keep going, they got their team, they keep moving forward, and then all of a sudden, oh yeah, there's this guy again who my predecessor said was a really good guy, but I'd never worked with him before. Do we want him on the team? So, that was one of those things that even the best laid plans too, occasionally it can be rocky on reentry, but the sooner, like I knew a year ahead of time we were coming back. It's like I really want to make sure I had the right role waiting for him when I got back. So
yeah. Start paving that path early.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, you probably start paving that path on your way out,
I did.
Absolutely. Yeah, in an ideal world. Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, excellent conversation, guys. And Greg, Steve, and Alex, all 3 of you. I have some questions, and maybe one observation. So let me start, Greg. Thanks for sharing the insight. Very interesting observation. you said that you're not sure, you made a lot of mistakes, right? But when you're expressing today, let me be honest, what I was observing, the satisfaction of taking global role and making it successful, I felt in your eyes more than what you have lost in your retirement side, benefit side of it. So help me understand that, isn't it?
I consider myself very fortunate to have had the opportunities that I had with Adidas for 21 of my 30 years. I know that of the 60,000 employees in the company, those who had the opportunity to go places that I went, do things I did, meet people that I met, and still have friendships and contacts and connections with those folks today. That's immeasurable. I don't downplay that at all. Had I been smarter about international mobility on my first assignment, had Adidas been smarter about international mobility on my first assignment, because when I did this, we're back in the 90s, which is probably before, some of you guys might have even been born. A lot of this stuff was just fly by the seat of the pants. I mean, yeah, okay. As I said, our guys from Germany, we need somebody in product development, they'd ship them off to Hong Kong. But this whole thing of true international mobility and IAP programs and repatriation and international benefit programs, and it didn't exist. And it was the consulting companies were just getting their feet wet, so to speak, and wading into it. So had I known then what I knew by the end of my career or no day, I could have positioned myself differently going out. So what would have been different? I might have been getting a little larger Social Security payment each month, but would that really be worth what I gained in the process?
Exactly.
No. Yeah. But when you go to advising other people, like we just talked about, are you going for 2 years or are you going to be going for 21 years? I mean, the joke with my wife, she'll tell you, is that I came home after that phone call with Peter that day. I came home and I said, would you consider doing a 2-year assignment overseas with me? And we did. And 21 years later, we came home. She tells people, you can't count. It was 2 years. And I said, it was 2. It was the first one and the last one. I just didn't know how many were going to be in the middle. So, yeah, I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed what I did. The time in Hong Kong was tougher on her because for the first time in her life, she wasn't working. Hong Kong is a very small place with a ton of people.
Yes, I've seen.
Yeah, when we were looking at going, she actually got on some chat site and was saying, "Hey, we're looking at moving to Hong Kong. My husband's being transferred. Is it a place that's safe for a woman to be out alone?" This guy sends her back and says, "Lady, there's 12 million people in 50 square miles. No matter where you go, you'll never be alone."
Exactly.
So it's kind of that kind of a scenario. But yeah, I mean, we wouldn't take anything for the opportunities that we had and the experiences that we gained and the people that we met. And so I didn't mean to downplay that at all. But
I'm just appreciating the last quick one is keeping time and Steve's. Now, this is a very interesting observation, or maybe as an HR leader, most of the times we keep talking internally about people. Now, if you're moving, suppose a very smart global sales guy head to another region, it's not necessary that that person has those connects in the market ready, right? But the skill set that person may bring in may change the market. So how does HR come into play into because this is business related? If you
First thing is, depending on what market we're in and where we're sending somebody to, especially if they're a salesperson. Sales is tremendously about relationship. And building and maintaining relationships. Sale is, in order to build and maintain relationships you've got to fit the culture. So is it necessarily that if I were to take a sales guy out of the US and send him off to be the head of sales in China?
Yep.
Who's going to translate for it? The customer you're calling on doesn't speak English. If you're calling a big corporation, maybe, or And we had that experience where the head of sales in China was a Frenchman, that we actually had to put a person in his team that went with him everywhere and translated.
Right.
You know, so there are those kind of hurdles and roadblocks that you have to look at. So again, it's, you know, am I putting the right person? You know, they're the great sales guy in the U.S. Man, they have taken us through the roof, and I need, you know, I'm really struggling in country X. I need the talent, and then we put it over there. Did you do the homework? You know, is his personality going to fit in? I mean, sales folks in the U.S. are, you know, big talkers and a lot of ego and a lot of jokes and things like that. That a lot of those jokes may not be appropriate in the countries they go to. And you just took away one of their great keys and success tools, because they can't go in and build that kind of rapport with people. And so, yeah, a lot of stuff to consider. You know, and Steve and I talked about this the other day. You know, this is not something you do in an hour. You know, we could spend an hour a day for the next 6 months and still not cover everything. But yeah, a really good point. You know, and especially when you're looking at roles that are going to be more than internally facing. If you're looking at roles that are going to be externally facing, it brings another dimension into play for looking at, you know, what's the fit going to be.
Maybe we'll keep talking later with Steve through wire, Steve. A lot of stuff to discuss. But thanks for sharing it.
A lot of stuff.
Yeah, we could go for a long time, but I want to thank Gregg for your thoughts, and for both Alex and Pranav for joining this discussion. One of the things I'm struck with is, from just about everybody, the four of us and others you can talk to, what a marvelous opportunity this is to change a life and change the trajectory of a career. It doesn't always work. It probably is more risky for the company than it is for the executive.
Absolutely.
Actually, you know, at the end of the day, you know, there's quite a large percentage of executives who are on an international assignment who may leave early and come home. Or once they're home, it's about 40% who will exit the company within the year. So for the company to get it right is something that is of critical importance to them. If not, this is a really risky thing. But certainly an opportunity for people to change the trajectory of their careers. Gregg, thank you. And thank you, everybody who's been part of this today.
Yeah, thanks for hosting, Steve.
Great.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye now.